Book 31 of 2020 was Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. So this is the, I guess, follow-on from Sapiens. So I imagine if you liked Sapiens, you will probably like this one too. Harari kind of talks about in the beginning how as a species we have pretty much eradicated, kind of comparatively, plague, war and famine. I mean, he might want to kind of rethink his thing about plague since recent times, but what he kind of says still fits. So he kind of talks about how we have like welfare, so no one actually these days starves to death. Like, it's, people don't die of starvation in the street anymore, in kind of like a developed world. And even within places that are developing, there is humanitarian aid and international efforts in that way, so there's less people that are dying of starvation, so dying of famine. And because of things like advancements in medicine and science, plague is less likely, and international efforts as well mean that that war is not something that kind of happens as much anymore. Harari kind of talks about how in history peacetime wasn't like a given. It was like a momentary absence of war. So now peacetime's actually a plausible thing, something that we kind of expect. But in history, there was never peace. There was always people warring with each other. So modern Homo sapien, I was going to say Homo Deus then, modern Homo sapien has kind of like eradicated war as an issue. Obviously, there's still kind of war that goes on, but they're generally in isolated areas of the globe, and they're often because of, instability in terms of they have kind of archaic economic structures, which is why there's a lot of instability there and why there's kind of war that happens. I mean, thinking about this as a kind of critical point, you could question this because actually, you can say, oh yeah, war's not happening, but there's always kind of like missile strikes on places and things like that, and it's not, it's in places where there is archaic economic structures and where there is instability, but it's still from developed nations that are putting the missile strikes over there. So you could probably be a little bit critical of that. Harari also talks about how terrorism and fundamentalists are very provocative because they will kind of organise terror attacks, because what their actual intention is to provoke the developed nation into kind of righteous indignation so that they'll strike back. But by striking back, what they're doing is they're giving the fundamentalists what they want, because the fundamentalists have limited resources and they can't kind of overthrow a dictator themselves. They don't have the resources. So if they kind of provoke a developed nation to kind of intercede, unknowingly on their behalf, then they can create that power vacuum for them that they can then take advantage of. So things like 9/11, which created the whole kind of, Al-Qaeda and going into Afghanistan. I don't actually know if Harari was talking about Afghanistan, but Iraq, for example, and that what happened there was Saddam Hussein taking out a dictator, but then it left a power vacuum, and then you've got kind of everybody fighting for ownership of certain provinces and things like that. So the point of terrorism is to provoke into a strike back, to create a power vacuum that they can then take advantage of. So it would be better to not kind of retaliate, because that's kind of what they want. They want a destabilisation of power structures to take advantage of that. Harari also talks about how we have this kind of preference for capital growth. So we got this kind of dogmatic ideology in GDP, which I've spoken about on other book reviews that I've done. And this kind of endorsement of a free market, it kind of leads to unethical choices and unethical decisions. So, for example, with global warming, we all know that we should be reducing emissions. That's going to benefit the planet. But if you reduce emissions, you have a danger of slowing down growth and therefore, reducing GDP and all of that. So rich people are not really going to want to do that because it's not in their best interest. You know, if you're rich and you benefit from this free market and capitalism and unethical choices so that you can make more money, if there is a global catastrophe, you know, you can put your money on a high-tech arc that will save you from global catastrophe. You know, things like Snowpiercer exist because that's kind of in the minds of people that are rich, you know, to save themselves. Like, you know, if you don't have a lot of money, you're not going to be able to save yourself. Like, you should really be working towards trying to, you know, help with global warming. You know, people like wanting to go to Mars and things, you know, you should be saving the planet that we've got right now. Like, that should be your focus, not trying to get to Mars. You know, once we've like messed up this planet, it's just silly, isn't it? Harari also talks though about free market, because he's saying that free market's a bad thing because it leads to unethical choices, but it is a good thing as well because you have a distributed data processing of the stock exchange, and the alternative to that is a centrally governed like system, economic system, in a kind of like analogous to communism, and that can't work because it can't survive past fast-paced change, because the free market will correct itself through competition. So it naturally kind of corrects for, you know, changes in things. But if it's centrally governed, you have to kind of make the decisions yourself about everything, and you can't know everything and be everywhere at the same time. You need it to be like a distributed data processing system for it to work. And so we have to have a free market, and we can't have a centrally governed, you know, communist style of economic government. And this is why communist regimes often suffer economically, because it's not possible to be able to run a system. You need to have something that's self-correcting. So whilst on the one hand capitalism is bad because it's unethical, it's good because it doesn't lead to, you know, economic destruction, which, you know, a centrally governed system would do. Harari kind of uses an example about somebody from a communist place, I think it was Russia, asking like, how do they, you know, allocate the price of bread in the bakeries? And they're like, well, the market does it for us, we don't have to do that. So it's interesting really when you think about economics from that kind of point of view. Whilst communism is, well, not necessarily communism actually, socialism is good in terms of like humanitarian side, in terms of like education and you know, health and, you know, welfare and all that kind of stuff. It's not good in terms of economic sense, which is why a lot of people don't like socialism, because economically it doesn't work. Harari also talks about how education, health and welfare were never kind of introduced for the benefit of people individually. They were for the strengthening of the nation. The nation needed strong soldiers, needed strong engineers, and the only way to get strong engineers and soldiers is to educate them to be able to be literate enough to follow kind of orders, and to, you know, design, I don't know, bridges or whatever if you're an engineer, I don't know. They had to be healthy, because if, you know, they're dying young, or you know, they've got malnutrition, you know, the limbs aren't working or whatever, that's not going to, you know, strengthen your nation. And same with welfare. So they were never like introduced to benefit you as an individual. They were introduced to benefit the country. And so Harari's kind of talking about how nowadays we kind of view those things as a human right. Like, we should have education, we should have health, we should have welfare, when it was never done for your benefit. Like, it was done for the benefit of the system, so the capitalist system. Harari also talks about how, you know, the introduction of pensions was never done because they're nice. It was done because it puts you in a Faust-bind. So like, you've sold your soul to the devil, because then it means that you'll pay taxes all your life. So, you know, you will pay taxes because you think that when you retire you'll get a pension. It's interesting how the pension age has steadily increased over time, and yet there's not been a revolt on taxes. You would think that people would revolt more, because now they have to pay taxes and not really get them back in terms of a pension. And I understand the government's kind of perspective on that, because we are living longer, and then that means that it's not as financially beneficial for them, because the pensions are done for the benefit of the government, in the sense of you're going to die soon, so they don't have to pay that much. You probably paid more in taxes than what you're going to take out in your pension. So it is interesting that people haven't really clicked on, and people are always kind of saying, wanting more rights over the pension. You're not going to get it, because it was never done for your benefit anyway. It was done to stop you revolting for paying taxes. Because there was loads of, if you think about taxes in history, there's always revolts over taxes, always, but they never had pensions. So when they introduce the pension, it stops the revolting. It's clever, really, when you think about it, how we're manipulated by things like that. Because you've got to think individually, like you are going to get old and you're not going to be able to work. So it does kind of seem like it would be beneficial to do that to get your pension. But obviously it's a Faust-bind, because it's not a fair trade. Faust is a story, by the way. If you look into it, it'll make more sense what I'm saying. Also, what they found was that if you grant people political rights, so for example, being able to elect a member, representative, like we elect in elections. I was like saying the same word, elected elections, like politicians and things like that. People are more likely to be like motivated and have initiative in like their life and in work, because I suppose it's giving you a sense of ownership, so therefore you're more likely to make something of it. So they found that was better than I knew I was going to say that wrong. Aristocratically governed people, because obviously there's less likely to revolt, because you feel like you're in control when you're actually not. They don't really care that you've voted. Like the people that they want to get in will get in, because they use propaganda and they manipulate. And they pay people to publish things in newspapers and things like that. Like, it's not fair how it's done if you actually look into it and think about it. So then going back to what I was mentioning before, this whole kind of like idea of individual happiness, it's been kind of subverted, because it was never all these things were never for individual happiness. They were to help the nation and to help the kind of monarchy and the government, primarily the government. But it's been subverted to have a focus on individual happiness. Everyone seems to have this kind of belief that they deserve to be individually happy, they deserve to have rights and things like that, which was never the case in history. Like, this is a new modern thing. It's a modern part of our Homo sapien experience. But interestingly, Harari also talks about how we've got this kind of focus on GDP and capitalism and all of that, but it's actually negatively correlated with suicide. So, as GDP is increasing and living standards are increasing, suicide, not negatively, positively correlated, suicide rates are also going up. So you'd think, wouldn't you, that if your living conditions are better, that you would be more happier and therefore you would be less likely to commit suicide, but that's not the case. Suicide rates are higher in better like living condition places. I didn't say that very well, but you know what I mean. So Harari kind of tries to explain this a little bit by saying that our happiness is based on our expectations. So if we expect things that we don't have, so if kind of like reality and expectation is close, you'll be happy. If they're very far away, you'll be unhappy and unsatisfied and probably more likely to commit suicide. Well, that's kind of one explanation that Harari's kind of positing. What he suggests is it's probably better to look at things like growth, domestic happiness, which is another measure that's used in certain countries, because you would think that we'd want to aim for like a society where we're all kind of happy rather than we're all prosperous with like GDP, because why would you want to like be rich but miserable? Like, you wouldn't want to be, would you? What they've actually found is that people, once they get to a certain kind of like level of prosperity, the happiness kind of doesn't increase anymore. So that's not what's kind of making us happy. Harari also talks about kind of like this individualism and kind of contrast that by saying that social humanism kind of says that focusing on individual happiness and individual needs and things is a a bourgeoisie indulgence, because what you should actually be thinking about is society as a whole, and making everybody within society happy rather than yourself. And that actually what you should be doing is questioning social structures and the power structures and your place within that, because even if you try to be the best that you can be and try to, you know, create wealth and prosperity, you will be restricted by the power structures that you are contained within. So, you know, class systems and things like that. And if there's systemic issues and whatever, then that's gonna reduce your ability to, you know, become individually prosperous. So you need to kind of look at it from a social kind of explanation. Harari kind of moves on as well to talk about consciousness, and how Homo sapiens have this kind of viewpoint that they're the only ones within the you know, planet and animal kingdom that have consciousness and therefore have feelings, and this kind of explains why people are generally okay with not giving animals human rights. And so, you know, when they, you know, they've domestically reared animals but they don't treat them well and they don't have good lives, and he kind of goes into that and talks about that in more detail, because really what gives us the right over another animal? You know, animals have actually been shown. So Harari gives lots of examples of psychological studies that I was already aware of, but he went through them to kind of explain how animals are conscious and they do kind of know what's going on, and so therefore they do feel emotional pain in the same way that we do, and therefore we should treat them with dignity. Harari also talks about the written word and talks about how that creates kind of I knew I was going to say that wrong. I can never say this word properly. Bureaucracy, that's it. It's because it's like not spelt the same way as what I say it. And how there's kind of like being an industrialization of assessment. So assessments are always kind of like marked. You know, in history, you either passed something or you didn't, like you got the qualification or you didn't. There was no kind of marks to kind of distinguish it. And this kind of like industrialization has meant that there's a kind of preference on those marks rather than on understanding, which, you know, they want anyway. They don't want you to understand things because they don't want you to question things. They want you to just go ahead and believe what they tell you, basically. So that's kind of also why there's an industrialization of marks. And then Harari kind of goes on to talk about like the future and if technology is used, that actually being conscious is not necessarily a good thing, because being conscious makes mistakes, human error and things like that. So a non-conscious intelligence would probably be more beneficial because it's less likely to make mistakes. It can use algorithms and get everything right, and this can probably create a better society, but then people are going to be jobless, and also the rich are probably going to monopolise on that. And Harari also talks about integration of technology within your body, so like having parts of your body that's kind of a computer. Then obviously there's going to be difference in inequality between people, because rich people are going to be a lot better like capable than what, you know, people who aren't rich are going to be. So that, you know, there's going to be more inequality than what there is today. And he also talks about as well, if you feed all your data into systems that might predict better life, you know, health outcomes, dating, anything like that, then you've got kind of privacy concerns because that data could be manipulated. And, you know, it's making me think of like totalitarian governments and things like that kind of controlling you. So overall, you know, really, really interesting discussion of lots of different things, and kind of, you know, talking about how our species has developed and kind of where it's going. So obviously Sapiens talks about all about the history of Homo sapiens, and this is kind of like talking still a little bit about like modern history rather than kind of ancient history, and then kind of going towards what's going to be in the future. So it was very, very interesting. It's also supported by a lot of kind of psychological studies, which I was aware of already, but they were integrated in nicely to support what he was talking about. You know, there's a lot of kind of, you know, integration of sociological kind of knowledge and I can never say that word either, anthropological research as well, or information. So very, very interesting. I would definitely recommend it to read, just because it's intellectually stimulating. It's not necessarily kind of critical or in lots of detail, because there's quite a lot of stuff that's discussed, and it does feel a little bit like it's brief in parts, and it's a bit like, it's just being touched on rather than, you know, analysed deeply. So I gave it 3 stars out of 5 for that reason. And because as well I did know like a lot of the kind of things that I talked about already. There was only like a couple of things that I was like, yeah, that's kind of like new information, that's good. But I did enjoy reading it, which is why I gave it the 3 stars, and I would recommend it to read, because it is, you know, it's like a nice kind of summary of things that you could then probably go and find more information out about.